The auditorium was cold that morning, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you want to pull your jacket tighter. But Judge William Hart didn't seem to notice. He sat in the third row, ramrod straight in his chair, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he scribbled notes on his scoring sheet. The harsh overhead lights cast shadows across his weathered face, making his expression even more severe than usual. If you asked anyone in the classical music community about William Hart, they'd tell you the same thing. Fair, yes. Knowledgeable, absolutely. But warm, encouraging? Not even close. He'd been judging youth music competitions for over a decade, and in that time, he'd developed a reputation that made teenage musicians' hands shake before they even touched their instruments. Parents whispered his name in music school waiting rooms like it was a curse. Teachers warned their students that if Hart was on the panel, they'd better bring their absolute best or don't bother showing up at all. The thing about Hart wasn't that he was cruel. He never insulted anyone or raised his voice. His weapon was something far more cutting: indifference. When a performance failed to meet his standards, he'd simply raise his hand, that small, efficient gesture that meant stop. No explanation. No constructive feedback. Just that raised hand and 2 words. Thank you. That's sufficient. Then he'd look down at his notes, already dismissing you from his mind before you'd even left the stage. Today was the preliminary round of the regional youth music competition, and Hart had already sat through 17 performances. 17 renditions of the same tired pieces that every piano student seemed to play. Another Moonlight Sonata, another Feuerlise, another Bach prelude that the kid clearly hadn't practiced enough. By the time the morning break rolled around, Hart had cut short 8 performances. 8 teenagers had walked off that stage with red faces and tears threatening to spill, knowing their dreams of making it to the finals had just evaporated. In front of an audience of their peers and parents, the other judges on the panel, a kindly retired piano teacher named Mrs. Rodriguez and a younger conductor from the state university, kept shooting uncomfortable glances at Hart. They'd worked with him before. They knew how he operated. But protocol was protocol, and Hart's expertise was undeniable. If he said a performance wasn't competition-worthy, it usually wasn't. Still, that didn't make it any easier to watch these kids' faces crumble. After the break, the auditorium slowly filled again. The atmosphere was tense now. Word had spread during those 15 minutes. Hart's in rare form today, someone whispered. He's cutting them off left and right. Parents squeezed their children's shoulders a little tighter. A few kids who'd been scheduled for afternoon slots were seriously considering faking illness and going home. The stage manager called the next number. Contestant 18, Lily Patterson. A girl walked out from the wings, and if you'd blinked, you might have missed her. She wasn't the type to command attention. 17 years old, maybe a senior in high school, with brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her dress was navy blue and looked like it had been borrowed from someone else. A little too long in the hem, a little too loose in the shoulders. Her shoes were the kind you'd wear to church, black and practical, with scuffs on the toes that suggested they'd seen better days. But it was her face that told the real story. Nervous, yes. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her sheet music, but there was something else there too. Determination. The kind of quiet, stubborn determination you see in people who've had to fight for everything they've got. Lily walked to the piano bench and adjusted it carefully, precise movements that suggested she'd practiced this part too. She set her sheet music on the stand, and for just a moment her fingers brushed across the top of the piano, like she was introducing herself to an old friend. Then she sat down, placed her hands above the keys, closed her eyes, and took a slow breath. Hart glanced at his program. Lily Patterson, 17, homeschooled. Performing Nocturne in E-flat major by Chopin. He suppressed a sigh. Of course it was Chopin. Another Chopin nocturne. How original. Lily began to play. Her technique was decent. Not exceptional, but decent. Her fingers found the right notes. Her tempo was mostly steady, and she clearly knew the piece well enough to play it from memory despite the sheet music in front of her. But there was something missing. That indefinable spark that separated a good performance from a great one. That emotional depth that made you forget you were sitting in an uncomfortable auditorium chair and transported you somewhere else. Entirely, Hart had heard this particular nocturne played brilliantly by students half her age. He'd heard it played by professionals who made the piano sing like it had a soul. What he was hearing now was competent, adequate, the musical equivalent of a well-written essay that says nothing new. 60 seconds passed. 70. 80. At the 90-second mark, Hart raised his hand. "Thank you, Miss Patterson. That will be sufficient." His voice cut through the music like a knife through butter. Lily's hands froze mid-phrase, the final chord hanging unresolved in the air. The silence that followed was deafening. Hart had already looked back down at his scoring sheet, his pen moving across the paper. Next to Lily's name, he wrote a single word, adequate. Then he circled the no box next to advance to finals. Mrs. Rodriguez shifted in her seat, her kind face troubled. The young conductor looked down at his hands. They'd learned not to argue with Hart in front of the contestants. It wasn't professional, and honestly, it never changed his mind anyway. On stage, Lily hadn't moved. She sat frozen at the piano bench, her face flushed red from her neck to her hairline. You could see her chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. The kind of breathing that happens when you're trying desperately not to cry in public. Most kids, when Hart cut them off, would scramble to gather their music and flee the stage as quickly as possible. Better to retreat and fall apart in private than let everyone see your humiliation. That's what Hart expected. He was already preparing to call the next contestant, but Lily didn't move. The seconds stretched out, uncomfortable and awkward. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. Still, Lily sat there, her hands now resting in her lap, her eyes fixed on the keys in front of her. Hart looked up, irritation flickering across his face. "Miss Patterson, the audition has concluded. Please clear the stage for the next performer." Finally, Lily turned to look at him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice when she spoke was steady. Maybe a little shaky around the edges, but steady enough. "Sir, the competition rules state that each performer is entitled to play 2 contrasting pieces. I've only played 1. The auditorium went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on that stage. This didn't happen. Kids didn't talk back to Judge William Hart. They certainly didn't quote competition rules at him. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyebrows shot up. The young conductor actually smiled a little before catching himself. A few audience members whispered to each other. Hart's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or annoyance. Possibly both. He reached for the rule book that sat on the table in front of him, flipped it open to the marked page, and scanned the text he'd helped write 5 years ago. She was right. Technically, completely right. Each contestant was guaranteed the opportunity to perform 2 pieces unless they were disqualified for rule violations. Being mediocre wasn't a rule violation. Hart had just gotten so used to kids accepting his dismissal without question that he'd forgotten about this particular clause, or maybe he'd just stopped caring about it. He closed the rule book with a soft thump. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For a long moment, he simply looked at Lily, this teenage girl in her borrowed dress and scuffed shoes who'd had the audacity to stand up to him. "Very well," he said finally, his voice clipped and cold. "You may proceed with your second piece. But I suggest you make it count, Miss Patterson. It was meant to be intimidating, a warning that she'd just used up whatever goodwill she might have had." But if Lily was intimidated, she didn't show it. She simply nodded once, turned back to the piano, and began shuffling through her sheet music to find the second piece. Hart leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, his expression carved from stone. He'd give her the regulation time for her second piece. But after this little display of defiance, she'd better bring something extraordinary. Otherwise, she'd just made her humiliation twice as long for absolutely nothing. Lily's hands were shaking worse now than when she'd first walked onto the stage. But they weren't shaking from nerves anymore. It was something else. Adrenaline, maybe, or anger, or that strange mix of emotions that floods through you when you've just done something brave and terrifying and can't quite believe you actually did it. She found the sheet music for her. Second piece tucked behind the Chopin Nocturne. The pages were older than the first ones, slightly yellowed at the edges with handwritten notes in the margins. She set them carefully on the music stand, smoothing out a corner that had folded over. Judge Hart watched her with the expression of a man who'd just been mildly inconvenienced and was determined to make sure everyone knew it. His arms remained crossed over his chest. His mouth was set in a thin line. Mrs. Rodriguez gave Lily a small, encouraging smile, but the girl didn't see it. She was focused entirely on the piano in front of her. blocking out everything else, the audience, the judges, the whispers still rippling through the auditorium. For a moment, Lily just sat there with her hands in her lap, staring at the keys. To the audience, it might have looked like she was gathering courage. But it was more than that. She was having a conversation with herself, one of those rapid internal dialogues that happen in the space of a few heartbeats. What was she doing? She'd already been rejected. Playing another piece wouldn't change Hart's mind. Men like him didn't change their minds. They certainly didn't suddenly decide they'd been wrong about some nobody kid from nowhere. All she was doing was prolonging the inevitable, stretching out her humiliation in front of all these people. The smart thing would be to pack up her music right now, walk off this stage with whatever dignity she had left, and try to forget this whole disaster. But then she thought about Mrs. Helen Brennan, her piano teacher. Mrs. Brennan was 81 years old now, living in a nursing home with walls the color of oatmeal and nurses who talked too loud like she was deaf instead of just old. 3 years ago, Mrs. Brennan had been sharp as a tack, still teaching piano to a small group of dedicated students from her home. Then the stroke had happened and everything had changed. Before she'd lost her ability to play, Mrs. Brennan had called Lily to her house one final time. Her right hand didn't work quite right anymore, but she'd managed to play through a piece with just her left hand and a few fumbling attempts with the right. "This is important," she'd said, her words slightly slurred but her eyes fierce and clear. "This music needs to be heard. It was written by someone special, someone the world forgot. Promise me you'll play it. Promise me you'll let people hear it," Lily had promised. And she didn't break her promises even when keeping them was hard. Especially when keeping them was hard. She lifted her hands to the piano keys. Then she closed her eyes, took one more deep breath and began to play. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, like someone testing the temperature of water before diving in. A simple melody, nothing flashy or technically impressive. The kind of music that doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but instead sneaks up on you quietly, like the first light of dawn. Hart's expression didn't change. He'd heard thousands of pieces in his years as a judge. Some good, most mediocre, a few exceptional. This one so far seemed unremarkable. Pleasant enough, but nothing special. He prepared himself for another 2 or 3 minutes of adequacy before he could finally move on to the next contestant. But then something shifted. The melody developed, grew, deepened. Lily's hands moved across the keys with a fluidity that hadn't been there in the Chopin piece. This wasn't just playing notes on a page. This was something else. Something that came from somewhere deeper than technique or training. The music had a quality that was hard to define. A kind of aching sweetness, like the feeling of remembering something precious that you'd almost forgotten. In the audience, people stopped whispering. A mother who'd been comforting her daughter after an earlier disappointing performance looked up. A father who'd been checking his phone put it away. Even the stage manager, who'd seen hundreds of these performances and usually tuned them out while doing paperwork, paused and listened. The piece wasn't technically difficult. There were no lightning-fast runs or dramatic crescendos. No moments designed to make the audience gasp or applaud, but it had something that all the flash and technique in the world couldn't manufacture. It had heart. It had truth. It felt like someone telling you a story they'd been holding inside for years, finally trusting you enough to share it. Mrs. Rodriguez had tears in her eyes. The young conductor had stopped taking notes entirely, his pen forgotten in his hand, and Judge William Hart had gone completely still. The color had drained from his face. His arms had uncrossed at some point, his hands now gripping the edge of the table in front of him. His expression, usually so carefully controlled, had cracked. Shock, confusion, and something that looked painfully like grief were all fighting for space on his weathered features. He knew this music. That realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He knew this melody, every single note of it. He knew the way the right hand carried the main theme while the left hand provided that gentle, rocking accompaniment. He knew the little trill that came in the second verse, that small flourish that most composers would consider unnecessary, but that somehow made the whole piece feel complete. He knew the way it built to a quiet climax and then settled back down again like waves on a shore. He knew it because his wife had written it. Catherine. God, Catherine. He hadn't thought about her music in years, hadn't let himself think about it because thinking about it meant feeling everything he'd worked so hard to bury. The loss, the regret, The crushing weight of all the years he'd had with her and all the years he'd never get. His wife had been a composer, not a famous one, not someone whose name appeared in history books or whose works were performed in concert halls. She'd written music for the pure joy of it, never seeking recognition or acclaim. She'd fill notebooks with her compositions, play them on their old upright piano in the evenings while he read the newspaper or graded student papers. Her music had been the soundtrack of their life together, the thing that made their modest home feel warm and full and complete. This piece, the one this teenager was playing right now on this stage, was one of Catherine's. She'd called it Morning Light Through Rain because she'd composed it one Sunday morning while watching the sun break through storm clouds. She'd played it for him dozens of times, maybe hundreds, always with that same gentle smile on her face. It had never been published. She'd never even written it out in final form, just kept it in one of her many notebooks full of half-finished compositions and musical sketches. Catherine had died 15 years ago. Pancreatic cancer diagnosed too late, gone too fast. Hart had boxed up all her music notebooks and sheet music and put them in the attic. He'd told himself he was preserving them, keeping them safe. But really, he'd been hiding them. Hiding from them. Because looking at her handwriting, seeing the notes she'd penned was too painful. It made her absence too real. He'd never played her music again. Never listened to recordings of the few pieces she'd performed at local recitals. He'd sealed that part of his life away and tried to move forward, throwing himself into his work, into judging, into the safe distance of evaluating other people's music instead of feeling the emotions that music could stir up. And now, somehow, impossibly, this girl was playing Catherine's composition, note for note, exactly as Catherine had played it. The same tempo, the same dynamics, even that little rubato in the bridge where Catherine always lingered just a moment longer than the rhythm strictly required. Hart's vision blurred. He realized with distant horror that there were tears on his face. Actual tears, running down his cheeks in front of his fellow judges, in front of the audience, in front of this room full of strangers and colleagues. He, William Hart, who prided himself on his objectivity and professional detachment, was crying at a youth piano competition. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed. She reached over and gently touched his arm, her face full of concern. "William, are you all right?" He couldn't answer. He couldn't speak. All he could do was listen as decades of carefully constructed walls crumbled with each measure of the music. The piece wasn't long, maybe 3 minutes total, but those 3 minutes contained everything. His wife's joy, her gentleness, her particular way of seeing beauty in simple things, the essence of who Catherine had been, distilled into melody and harmony. When Lily played the final chord and the sound faded into silence, no one moved. The auditorium was so quiet you could hear the heating system humming in the vents. Lily opened her eyes and lifted her hands from the keys. She looked uncertain now, like someone waking up from a dream and trying to figure out where they were. She glanced toward the judges' table and saw Judge Hart standing up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face was wet with tears. His usually stern expression was completely shattered, replaced by raw emotion that he seemed unable or unwilling to hide. He stood there swaying slightly, one hand still gripping the table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The silence stretched out. Everyone waited for someone to do something, say something, break this strange, heavy moment. Finally, Hart spoke. His voice came out rough and broken, barely more than a whisper, but in the silence it carried all the way to the stage. "Where did you learn that piece?" Lily stared at Judge Hart, completely confused by what was happening. One moment she'd been playing her second piece, pouring everything she had into it. And now this severe man who'd cut her off so coldly was standing at the judge's table with tears streaming down his face, asking her a question she didn't understand. "Where did you learn that piece?" he asked again, his voice stronger this time but still shaking around the edges. The audience had started whispering again, a low buzz of confused voices. Mrs. Rodriguez had half risen from her seat, looking worried. The young conductor sat frozen, his eyes darting between Hart and Lily like he was watching something he couldn't quite believe. Lily's throat felt tight. She had to swallow twice before she could answer. "From my piano teacher, sir, Mrs. Helen Brennan." Hart took a step toward the stage, then seemed to catch himself. He braced both hands on the table in front of him, leaning forward. "Helen Brennan," he repeated, and something in his voice changed. Recognition, maybe, or disbelief. Helen Brennan from the conservatory? Class of 1968. I don't know what year she graduated, Lily said. But yes, she went to the conservatory. She told me that. She said it was the best 4 years of her life. Hart closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, fresh tears had appeared. He pulled off his glasses and wiped his face with the back of his hand. A gesture so vulnerable and human that it seemed completely at odds with the stern judge everyone knew. Several people in the audience were openly staring now, including some of the other contestants who'd peeked out from backstage to see what was causing all the commotion. "I need to know," Hart said, and now he was moving around the judges' table, walking toward the stage with steps that seemed uncertain, like a man who'd forgotten how his legs worked. "That piece you just played. Where did Mrs. Brennan get it? How does she have it?" Lily stood up from the piano bench, instinctively taking a small step back. This wasn't how auditions were supposed to go. Judges weren't supposed to cry. They weren't supposed to walk onto the stage during a performance. They certainly weren't supposed to look at you like you'd just shown them a ghost. "She said it was written by her college roommate," Lily said, her voice small and uncertain. "Someone she was really close to back at the conservatory. They lost touch after graduation, and she always regretted it. She said her friend was one of the most talented composers she'd ever known, but that the world never got to hear her music because she never tried to publish anything or perform professionally." Hart had reached the stage now. He climbed the 3 steps slowly, like each one required enormous effort. When he stood on the same level as Lily, just a few feet away, she could see that his hands were trembling. "What was the name?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did Mrs. Brennan tell you the composer's name?" Lily nodded, reaching for her sheet music. Her own hands weren't quite steady as she held up the pages. "It's written right here at the top. Catherine Hart." The sound that came out of Judge William Hart wasn't quite a sob, but it was close. He reached out toward the sheet music, then pulled his hand back like he was afraid touching it might make it disappear. "May I?" he asked. And Lily had never heard anyone sound so uncertain asking such a simple question. She handed him the pages. He took them with both hands, holding them like they were made of something infinitely precious and fragile. His eyes scanned the top of the page where someone had written the title in elegant, flowing script, "Morning Light Through Rain." Below that, in the same handwriting, "Composed by Catherine Hart, Spring 1969. "That's my wife's handwriting," he said, and his voice broke on the word wife. This is Catherine's composition. She wrote this the first year we were married. She played it for me on Sunday mornings. It was her way of saying good morning when words weren't enough. The auditorium had gone completely silent again. Even the whispers had stopped. Everyone was watching this scene unfold, this private moment of grief and recognition happening in the most public of spaces. Lily didn't know what to say. She stood there, feeling like she'd accidentally stumbled into something much bigger than she'd understood. "Mrs. Brennan told me that her roommate got married right after graduation," she said quietly. "She said that was part of why they lost touch. Life just pulled them in different directions. She always meant to reach out, to reconnect. But years passed and it got harder and harder until it felt too late." Hart looked up from the sheet music, his eyes meeting Lily's. Catherine talked about Helen all the time, especially in those first few years. They'd been so close at school. Best friends, really. Catherine used to say that Helen was the only person who truly understood her music. But we moved away from my teaching job, and Catherine was busy raising our daughter, and Helen was building her career as a performer and teacher. They exchanged Christmas cards for a few years, but eventually even that stopped. He looked back down at the music, his finger tracing along the staff lines. When Catherine got sick, she asked me to make sure her music was preserved. She had notebooks full of compositions, songs, piano pieces, even a few attempts at chamber music. I promised her I would. And then after she died, I put all of it in boxes in the attic. I told myself I was keeping it safe, but really I just couldn't bear to look at it. It hurt too much. Mrs. Rodriguez had come up onto the stage now too, moving quietly to stand near Hart. She didn't say anything, just offered her presence as support. The young conductor followed, looking like he wasn't quite sure what his role was in all this, but feeling like he should be there anyway. "Mrs. Brennan got sick about 3 years ago," Lily said, her voice soft. "A stroke. She can't play piano anymore. Before it happened, she was still teaching a few students, and I was one of them. I'd been studying with her for about a year when she had the stroke. After she got out of the hospital, she was different. Parts of her memory were fuzzy, and her right hand didn't work like it used to. But there was one thing she was absolutely clear about. Lily paused. Remembering that day in Mrs. Brennan's house, the afternoon light coming through the windows, the old piano that had seen decades of students' hands. She called me over to her house. She could barely play anymore, but she managed to get through this piece, the one I just played. She was crying the whole time. When she finished, she told me that she'd held on to this music for 50 years. She said it was time someone else carried it forward. She said Catherine's music deserved to be heard, that it was too beautiful to stay hidden away. Hart made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Helen kept Catherine's music all these years. Even after they lost touch, she kept it. Not just this piece, Lily said. Mrs. Brennan has a whole folder of your wife's compositions. She gave them all to me. She said I was her last student, and this was the most important thing she could teach me. Not technique or theory, but that music is about connection, about keeping beauty alive and passing it on to the next person who'll care for it. Hart looked at Lily then, really looked at her, seeing her for the first time not as contestant number 18 but as a person, a young woman who'd been entrusted with something precious, who'd had the courage to stand up to him when he'd dismissed her, who'd played his wife's music with such understanding and care that it had broken through 15 years of grief and avoidance. When Mrs. Brennan gave me these pieces, Lily continued, she told me that your wife never wanted recognition or fame. She just wanted her music to mean something to someone, to connect with people, to maybe make their morning a little brighter or help them feel less alone. She gestured at the sheet music in Hart's hands. She called that one Morning Light Through Rain because she said there was something hopeful about the sun breaking through clouds, about light finding its way through darkness. Hart nodded, unable to speak. He remembered that morning. He remembered Catherine sitting at their old piano, still in her bathrobe, playing this melody that had come to her in the night. He remembered how she'd looked up at him with that smile that had made him fall in love with her, and she'd said, "This is how I feel about us." Like morning light breaking through rain. Mrs. Rodriguez put a gentle hand on Hart's shoulder. "William, maybe we should take a short break." Give everyone a moment, but Hart shook his head. He carefully, reverently handed the sheet music back to Lily. Then he did something that shocked everyone in that auditorium, something that no one who knew Judge William Hart would ever have believed if they hadn't seen it with their own eyes. He smiled. Not a polite professional smile, a real one, warm and genuine and sad and grateful all at once. "Miss Patterson," he said, "would you play it again? Please, I'd like to hear it one more time." Lily looked at Judge Hart, at this man who moments ago had been so cold and dismissive, and saw someone completely different now. Someone vulnerable, someone who'd just been reunited with a piece of his past he thought he'd lost forever. When he asked her to play again, it wasn't a command from a judge. It was a request from a husband who missed his wife. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "Of course." She sat back down at the piano bench, her borrowed dress settling around her. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Something had shifted in the room, in the moment, in her. The fear and nervousness that had gripped her earlier had melted away, replaced by a sense of purpose. This wasn't about the competition anymore. It wasn't about advancing to the finals or proving herself to anyone. This was about honoring Mrs. Brennan's wish and giving this grieving man a gift he didn't know he needed. Hart moved to the side of the stage, close enough to hear every note but far enough not to intrude. Mrs. Rodriguez and the young conductor quietly returned to their seats at the judge's table. The audience sat in complete silence, sensing that they were witnessing something rare and sacred. Lily placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes, and began to play. This time, she played it differently. Not in the notes themselves, those remained exactly as written, but in the feeling behind them. The first time she'd played it, she'd been trying to get through it, to prove she deserved to be there. Now she was playing it for Hart, for Catherine, for Mrs. Brennan, for all the years and love and loss that these simple notes contained. The melody unfolded like a story being told around a fireplace on a winter night, gentle, intimate, full of warmth and quiet joy. You could almost see what Catherine had been describing. That moment when the sun breaks through rain clouds and suddenly everything is painted in gold light. The way the shadows disappear and the world feels new again, washed clean. Hart stood very still, his eyes closed, letting the music wash over him. Memories came flooding back. Not in the painful way they usually did, but softly, like old photographs being carefully taken out and looked at after years in a drawer. He remembered Catherine at their little piano, her fingers dancing across the keys. He remembered the way she'd hum along sometimes unconsciously, lost in her own music. He remembered their daughter as a baby, falling asleep in his arms while Catherine played. Sunday mornings with coffee cooling on the piano's top, with nowhere to be and nothing to do except exist together in those perfect, ordinary moments. For 15 years, he'd tried not to remember. He'd thought that was how you survived grief, by sealing it away, by staying busy, by never letting yourself feel too much. He'd become harder, more critical, more distant. He'd told himself it was about maintaining standards, about being professional, about treating all these young musicians fairly by holding them to the highest expectations. But the truth he was finally facing as he listened to his wife's music being played by this teenage girl in her borrowed dress, was that he'd been punishing the world for his loss. If he couldn't have joy and beauty in his own life, then he'd make sure everyone else had to earn it. He'd forgotten that music wasn't about perfection. Catherine had known that. She'd never been the most technically skilled pianist, but she'd played with such heart that technique didn't matter. When had he forgotten that? When had he started valuing technical precision over emotional truth? The piece came to its quiet conclusion, the final notes hanging in the air like the last bit of daylight before evening. Lily lifted her hands from the keys and opened her eyes. She looked over at Hart, uncertain what she'd see there. He was smiling through his tears. Not the stern, tight expression everyone knew. A real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. He looked younger somehow, or maybe just more human. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough but sincere. "Thank you for bringing her back to me, even if just for a few minutes." Lily felt her own eyes getting wet. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Hart walked back to the judge's table, but he didn't sit down immediately. He looked at Mrs. Rodriguez and the young conductor, then out at the audience of parents and students and teachers who'd all just witnessed something they hadn't expected when they'd come to a youth piano competition that morning. "I need to say something," Hart announced, his voice carrying across the auditorium, "and I need everyone here to hear it." The room went quiet again, waiting. "I've been judging music competitions for 12 years, he said. "And in that time, I've prided myself on being fair, objective, and maintaining high standards. I've told myself that by being strict, by accepting only the best, I was serving the art form. That I was preparing these young musicians for the real world where audiences and critics won't coddle them." He paused, looking down at his hands. "But I was wrong, or at least I was incomplete in my understanding. Yes, technique matters. Yes, practice and precision and musicianship are important, but they're not the only things that matter. They're not even the most important things." Mrs. Rodriguez was nodding, her kind face encouraging him to continue. "My wife was a composer," Hart said, and this was the first time he'd spoken about Catherine publicly in years. "A brilliant one, though the world never knew her name. She wrote music not because she wanted fame or recognition, but because music was how she understood the world, how she expressed love and joy and even sadness. And when she played, it didn't matter if she hit every note perfectly. What mattered was that you felt something, that you were moved." He looked directly at Lily now. "Miss Patterson, when you played that Chopin nocturne, I cut you off because it was technically adequate, but emotionally empty. And I was right about that. It was a competent performance, but nothing more. But I was wrong to dismiss you so quickly. I was wrong not to wonder what else you might have to offer." Several audience members shifted in their seats. A few of the other contestants who'd been cut off earlier in the day were watching with wide eyes. "When you played my wife's composition," Hart continued, "you played it with understanding and care and genuine feeling. You connected with the music in a way that technical skill alone could never achieve. And that, Miss Patterson, is what separates someone who plays notes from someone who makes music." He finally sat down, pulling his scoring sheet toward him. He picked up his pen, crossed out what he'd written earlier, and wrote something new. "Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Chen," he said to his fellow judges, "I'd like to revise my evaluation. Miss Patterson's second piece demonstrated precisely the kind of musical maturity and emotional intelligence we should be looking for in our finalists. I vote to advance her to the final round." Mrs. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. "I agree completely." Her second piece was extraordinary. The young conductor, Mr. Chen, nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, absolutely, yes. That was the most moving performance I've heard all day. Lily's mouth fell open. She looked between the three judges, not quite believing what she was hearing. I'm advancing? You are, Hart said, and there was warmth in his voice now, a gentleness that had been absent before. Your Chopin needs work. We'll be honest about that, but your ability to connect with music, to understand what a composer was trying to express and convey that to an audience, that's something that can't be taught. That's a gift. The auditorium erupted in applause. Not the polite, obligatory clapping that usually followed performances, but genuine, enthusiastic applause. Several people stood up. A few of Lily's fellow contestants who'd been watching from backstage came out to peek around the curtain, clapping and calling out congratulations. Lily sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed. She'd come here this morning expecting nothing, hoping for a chance, and now this. She thought about Mrs. Brennan in her nursing home, probably sitting in her chair by the window, maybe wondering how the audition had gone. She couldn't wait to tell her, but Hart wasn't finished. He stood up again, raising a hand to quiet the applause. Miss Patterson, I have a request. A personal one, separate from the competition. Lily looked at him, curious and still a bit stunned. You said Mrs. Brennan has other compositions of my wife's, an entire folder of them. His voice was hesitant, hopeful. Would it be possible? Could I see them? I thought all of Catherine's music was locked away in my attic. I didn't know she'd shared her work with Helen. I'd very much like to see what pieces Helen kept all these years. Lily nodded immediately. Yes, of course, Mrs. Brennan would want that. I know she would. She told me she always regretted losing touch with your wife. She said it was one of her biggest regrets, not staying connected with the friend who'd understood her so well. After the competition concludes today, Hart said, would you have time to talk? I'd like to know more about Helen, about how she's doing and about these compositions. And perhaps, he hesitated, then continued, perhaps we could arrange for me to visit her. If she's willing. I think we have a lot to talk about after all these years. She'd love that, Lily said, and she meant it. Mrs. Brennan had spoken so often about her old friend Catherine, always with affection and sadness and lingering regret. To reconnect with Catherine's husband, to share memories and stories and music, it would mean everything to her. Hart smiled again, that real, genuine smile that made him look like a completely different person. Then it settled. After the final contestant performs today, please find me. We'll exchange contact information and make arrangements. He turned to address the entire auditorium one more time. And to everyone else here today, competitors and parents and teachers, I apologize. I've been harder than I needed to be, more critical than was fair or kind. Music should inspire joy, not fear. I forgot that, but I'm remembering it now. 3 weeks later, Lily found herself standing outside Shady Oaks nursing home, holding a folder of sheet music in one hand and her phone in the other. Judge Hart stood beside her, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. He'd dressed carefully for this visit. A button-down shirt and slacks instead of his usual formal suit, like he was trying to look approachable but wasn't quite sure how. She doesn't know I'm coming, does she? Hart asked for the third time since they'd met in the parking lot. I told her I was bringing a surprise, Lily said. A good one. She's been in better spirits this week, more alert. The nurses said it's a good day. Hart nodded, but his hands were shaking slightly. Lily pretended not to notice. It was strange seeing this man who'd seemed so intimidating and powerful just a few weeks ago, looking so vulnerable. But she was starting to understand that people were more complicated than they appeared. Judge Hart wasn't cruel or heartless. He'd just been carrying so much pain for so long that he'd forgotten how to set it down. They walked through the automatic doors into the nursing home. The place smelled like disinfectant and cafeteria food, with an underlying hint of air freshener that didn't quite cover the institutional smell. The walls were painted that particular shade of beige that seemed to exist only in hospitals and nursing homes. A television in the common room played a game show that nobody was watching. Mrs. Brennan's room was on the second floor. Number 247. Lily knocked softly before opening the door. Lily, sweetheart, is that you? Mrs. Brennan's voice came from inside, thin but warm. They entered the small room. Mrs. Brennan sat in a wheelchair by the window, a blanket across her lap despite the warm spring sunshine coming through the glass. She was smaller than Lily remembered, more fragile, the stroke having taken something from her that went beyond just the use of her right hand. But her eyes were bright and alert, And when she saw Lily, her whole face lit up. "There's my girl," she said. "Come here, let me look at you. Did you bring news about the competition? The finals are next week, aren't they?" "Yes, ma'am," Lily said, moving to give her teacher a gentle hug. "But that's not why I'm here today. I brought someone to meet you. Someone I think you'll want to see." Mrs. Brennan looked past Lily to where Hart stood in the doorway, uncertain and frozen. For a long moment she just stared at him, her expression confused. Then slowly recognition dawned across her face. "William," she whispered. "William Hart?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Good Lord," Mrs. Brennan said, and tears immediately sprang to her eyes. "After all these years. How did you find me?" Hart stepped into the room, moving slowly like he was afraid of breaking something. "Through Lily, through your student. She played one of Catherine's pieces at the competition." "Morning light through rain." Mrs. Brennan's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my. You heard it?" "I did." Hart pulled a chair over and sat down near her wheelchair, their knees almost touching. "Helen, why didn't you ever reach out? After Catherine died, why didn't you contact me? You had her music all this time." Mrs. Brennan's tears were flowing freely now. Her left hand trembled as she reached for a tissue from the box on the side table. "I didn't know she died, William. Not for years. By the time I heard, I ran into someone from the old conservatory crowd, must have been 8 or 9 years ago. By then it seemed too late. Too much time had passed. What would I say?
Sorry I wasn't there when your wife was dying?
Sorry I let our friendship fade. The regret was crushing, but I convinced myself that reaching out would just be selfish. That you'd moved on and didn't need some ghost from the past showing up." Hart shook his head. "Catherine talked about you all the time, even years after you'd lost touch. She'd say things like, 'Helen would have loved this,' or 'I wish I could show this to Helen.' You were never forgotten, Helen. Never." "I kept her music," Mrs. Brennan said, her voice breaking. "Every piece she gave me, every scrap of paper with notes on it. I kept it all these years because I couldn't bear to let go of her completely. Catherine was the most talented person I ever knew. Not because she had perfect technique, God knows she didn't, but because she understood something that most musicians never grasp. She understood that music is a conversation between souls." Lily stood back, watching these two old friends reconnect after decades apart. She'd served her purpose in bringing them together, and now this moment belonged to them. Hart reached out and took Mrs. Brennan's good hand in both of his. "I put all her music in boxes in the attic. After she died, I couldn't look at it. It hurt too much. I thought I was preserving it, but really I was just hiding from it. Hiding from her memory, because remembering meant feeling the loss all over again." "That's grief," Mrs. Brennan said gently. "It makes us do things that don't make sense. It makes us build walls to protect ourselves, even when those walls end up becoming prisons." They sat in silence for a moment. Two people who'd lived since they'd last seen each other, now connected again by music and memory and loss. "Lily told me you had a whole folder of Catherine's compositions," Hart said finally. "I'd like to see them if you're willing to share, and I'd like to share mine with you. There are boxes and boxes in my attic, pieces I'm sure you've never seen. Some of them were barely finished, just sketches of ideas, but they're all there. All her." Mrs. Brennan nodded eagerly. Yes, I'd like that very much. We could go through them together. You could tell me the stories behind them, and I could tell you the stories she told me about the ones I have." "More than that," Hart said, and now there was excitement in his voice, the kind of energy you hear from someone who's just had an idea that feels right and true. "I'd like to do something with her music, not keep it hidden away. Catherine never wanted fame, but she did want her music to mean something to people. She wanted it to be heard and felt and passed on. That's why she gave you these pieces, Helen. She trusted you to understand them." "What are you thinking?" Mrs. Brennan asked. Hart looked over at Lily, who'd been standing quietly near the door. "I'm thinking that Lily isn't the only young musician who could benefit from playing Catherine's work. What if we created a collection, published her compositions properly with proper notation and performance notes, made them available to music students and teachers? Catherine's pieces could be what they were always meant to be. Music that connects people, that teaches not just technique but feeling." Mrs. Brennan's eyes were shining. "A memorial collection. Catherine Hart's collected works." "Exactly. We could work on it together. You know her music as well as anyone. Better than I do in some ways. You understood it from a musician's perspective. Lily cleared her throat softly. If I could add something, Mrs. Brennan always said that Catherine's music was perfect for intermediate students. Technically accessible but emotionally sophisticated. Students at that level often get stuck playing the same old pieces everyone plays. This could give them something different, something special. Hart smiled at her. That's a wonderful point. Catherine would have loved that. She always said music shouldn't be locked away for only the most advanced players to enjoy. They spent the next 2 hours talking, the three of them. Mrs. Brennan shared stories about Catherine at the conservatory, her terrible habit of composing during lectures, her laugh that could be heard across campus, the time she'd written an entire piano sonata on napkins during a particularly boring recital. Hart shared stories from their marriage, Catherine composing lullabies for their daughter, writing little musical jokes for his birthday, playing piano at 3 in the morning when inspiration struck and she couldn't sleep. Lily listened and learned that the woman who'd written Morning Light Through Rain had been funny and imperfect and gloriously human. Not some distant historical figure, but a real person who'd loved and created and lived fully, even if briefly. As the afternoon wore on and the sunlight shifted across the room, they made plans. Hart would bring the boxes from his attic. Mrs. Brennan would provide her collection and her insights. They'd work together to prepare the pieces for publication, and Lily would be their test performer, helping them understand which pieces worked best and where students might need guidance. There's one more thing, Hart said as they prepared to leave. Lily, the finals are next week. What are you planning to play? I haven't decided yet, Lily admitted. I was thinking maybe the Chopin again, but better this time. Or possibly a Beethoven sonata. Hart and Mrs. Brennan exchanged glances. Play Catherine's piece, Mrs. Brennan said. Play Morning Light Through Rain. Not for me, not for William, but because it's beautiful and it deserves to be heard. And because I think you understand something now that you didn't before. You understand that the notes on the page are just the beginning. The real music happens in the space between the performer and the audience, in that moment of connection. Lily thought about it. Competition pieces were supposed to be impressive, flashy things that showcased technical skill. Catherine's composition was gentle and simple by comparison, but maybe that was exactly the point. Okay, she said, I'll play it. The finals came and went. Lily didn't win first place. That went to a 17-year-old prodigy who played Rachmaninoff with machine-like precision. But she won something better. She won second place, and more importantly, she won the Audience Choice Award. After her performance of Morning Light Through Rain, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Judge Hart, sitting in his usual spot at the judge's table, had smiled through his tears and given her the highest marks he'd ever given any contestant. Not because the piece was technically challenging, but because she'd played it with truth. 6 months later, the Catherine Hart Collection, Compositions for Intermediate Piano, was published by a small but respected music press. The foreword, written jointly by William Hart and Helen Brennan, told Catherine's story and explained the philosophy behind her music. On the dedication page there was a photo of Catherine at the piano, young and smiling, and beneath it a simple line, "For those who understand that music is love made audible." Lily performed at the book launch, playing Morning Light Through Rain to a room full of music teachers, students, and people who'd known and loved Catherine. When she finished, Hart walked up onto the stage and hugged her. This stern man who'd learned to be soft again, who'd learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is open yourself up to feeling something. "Thank you," he whispered, "for bringing her back to us." And Lily understood that she hadn't just played a piece of music that day in the auditorium. She'd helped heal something broken. She'd helped 2 old friends reconnect. She'd helped a man remember that love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It just changes form, becomes something you carry with you, becomes music that plays on in the hearts of those left behind. Sometimes the most important performances happen in ordinary moments, in places we don't expect, playing music that nobody famous has ever heard. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, those moments change everything.